What's up, nerds? Happy Monday. So in the Gospel of John, there's a famous story which Christian teachers love to reference. Shortly after Jesus' crucifixion, some of the disciples are gathered together in a room. As should be expected in this instance, this group of individuals were afraid. Like their leader had just been put to death, and many of them feared that they would be next. So, as one is wont to do when they are isolated from the outside world, they began discussing rumors they'd been hearing. When one of them mentioned that some of the disciples had actually claimed to see Jesus. Thomas, ever the skeptic, told them that unless he could put his hands in the holes in Jesus' wrists where they nailed him to the cross, he wouldn't believe that it was truly Jesus resurrected. I suppose it's the dramatic fashion with which Jesus comes into the story shortly afterward that makes the story of doubting Thomas a favorite of preachers and theologians. But for me, it's the words of Jesus himself which strike me as the most telling about this story. So, after showing his hands inside where his body had been pierced, Thomas aptly declared that, "Holy shit, this is definitely Jesus." Jesus then tells Thomas, "Yo man, you have seen me and then believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet believed." That's a direct quote, King James Version. This sense of an inherent value to beliefs in and of themselves is something that has infiltrated our modern egalitarian society. Doctors are often hesitant to recommend things that might go against patients' beliefs. Proponents of democracy and equality often feel conflicted when confronted with a culture's religion which seems to go against both of those ideas. But who are they to question someone else's deeply held beliefs, right? In fact, the evangelical saying, "Don't be a doubting Thomas," makes it clear that skepticism and unbelief share a nearly equal level of sin for Christians. I think that's why the doctrine itself feels so distasteful to me. When people ask why I'm not a Christian, it's very easy to get into tangents about the Bible not being written until nearly 100 years after Jesus' death, or abhorrent acts of the God of the Old Testament, or the ongoing battle against democracy being waged by the evangelical right in America. But none of these actually address my main reason for not being a follower of Christ. There are numerous people who have been able to marry their own beliefs about morality with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and honestly, I don't think they're necessarily wrong. After all, the golden rule, "do unto others as you would have them do unto you," is kind of the main foundation for much of modern utilitarian ethics. This idea certainly predates Jesus with parts of Buddhist philosophy, but at the end of the day, many of Jesus' teachings were very much, at the very least, ahead of his time. So why then do I not consider myself a follower or a believer in these teachings? Well, in a way, I actually am. I do hold to several of the ideas that Jesus is reported to have spoken. Jesus himself very likely would not agree with the ways in which I apply his teachings in the modern world, but I'm skeptical that Jesus would even be able to make sense of the modern world. But even beyond that, I think the idea of believing in one person is inherently flawed. If the recordings of Jesus' sermon are to be taken to be the actual words of Christ, I would personally have to agree with that 25% of them. It's the same as with Socrates, Plato, Immanuel Kant, Buddha, or any other teacher of the past. There is plenty of wisdom that can be drawn from teaching these people. But to think any of them are infallible or the ultimate source of wisdom it just, to me, feels like a dangerous position to take. Any idea that sets the precedent that you have to relinquish your own rationality and your own sense of reason should be approached with extreme skepticism. Now, one could argue that, I am myself a blind follower of science, but I would kind of have to push back on that. As much as I admire the accomplishments that science has brought us, I think the only thing that has protected science thus far is its own self-correcting tactics. Science works as well as it does because scientists themselves are willing and even eager to admit when they're wrong. But of course, once again, I've gotten completely off topic and away from the actual question that was being asked. The reason I am not a Christian is that I am, at my core, averse to believing things without evidence. This, of course, opens the floor up to the question of what evidence would I accept? What would convince me? And honestly, I can't imagine an evidence that would work for something this specific. The question of whether Jesus even existed is one that can also be debated. Even that premise has very little evidence to support it. The only reason that I personally assume Jesus to have existed is that the stories about him were presumably based on a real character, and someone very much like Jesus is not that unlikely to have existed. It's not a crazy claim. Of course, that does not negate the possibility of him being a myth. The bottom line is that To be a follower of Christ, you must above all else be someone who has faith. The Gospels are filled with times that Jesus criticizes people for the lack of faith or condones like a childlike level of faith. And I personally just don't have this kind of faith, and if I'm being honest, I don't even think it's a good thing to have it. I think having faith in institutions and societal systems can be very beneficial and even necessary very often. But that's not like the same thing as having blind faith. Unquestioning, unwavering faith is often heralded as like the greatest virtue, but I would challenge this proposition. Non-belief may be seen by the faithful as a risk, but I'd argue it's one well worth taking. More has been accomplished throughout history by people asking difficult questions than by those with childlike faith. Friends, I love you, love yourselves, and I'll see you next Monday.